Welcome to the Bedtime Sleepy History. Dim your lights, let the weight of the day melt away, and gently close your eyes. Breathe in slowly, and let yourself drift into a world long forgotten, where cold winds whisper across fjords and the crackle of firelight echoed softly against timber walls. Tonight, we journey deep into the heart of the Viking world. Not the world of raids and dragons, but the quiet, hidden world of their desires, their relationships, and the unspoken truths of intimacy. In this gentle voyage, we'll explore what sex and love were really like for the Vikings, far from modern myths, and nestled within the hush of communal longhouses, sagas, and sacred rites. And so, let's begin in the far northern reaches of the world, where the sun might linger high in the sky for endless hours in summer and disappear entirely in the deep folds of winter. Life for the Vikings was lived in a rhythm set by season, sea, and necessity. Their lives, though often portrayed in tales of conquest and thunder, were in truth anchored most deeply in the hearth, in the modest, enduring structure known as a longhouse. These longhouses, both home and sanctuary, were not merely places to eat and sleep, but the very core of social and emotional life. And it was within these low, smoke-darkened halls that relationships were born, shaped, and remembered in quiet moments shared under firs or by the flickering glow of fire. A longhouse was usually a long, rectangular building, its sides gently curving like the hull of a ship, its roof thick with overlapping layers of turf or thatch to keep out the biting cold. Walls were made from timber or wattle and daub, and they groaned softly in the wind, speaking the quiet language of the forest from which they were shaped. Inside, the layout was simple yet complete. A central hearth, long benches along each wall that doubled as beds, and an atmosphere thick with the mingling sense of wood smoke, cured meat, old wool, damp earth, and the musk of human closeness. There were no doors to individual rooms, no corridors or chambers to retreat into, and no private space untouched by the sounds and sights of others. In the Viking longhouse, life was lived communally in love, in all its forms, grew in plain sight of family, kin, and community. Families were large and layered, consisting not only of parents and children, but grandparents, siblings, servants, and sometimes slaves, all residing under the same sloped roof. The hearth at the center of the longhouse was not just a place to cook food or warm chilled fingers, but a sacred anchor of the household, where people gathered for storytelling, meals, mending clothes, preparing tools, or simply sitting in silence while the winter winds howled outside. At night, this fire was kept alive with care, as its embers were vital, both practically and symbolically, offering protection from the dark, and preserving a link to the gods and ancestors who were believed to dwell nearby. As the day waned and the darkness settled over the landscape like a heavy cloak, people would climb onto the benches lining the walls, pull furs over their bodies, and sleep, often side by side, husbands and wives next to one another, with children or elders close at hand. There was no secrecy to these arrangements, no chambers to withdraw into for whispered conversation or stolen intimacy. And yet, there was a certain kind of privacy afforded not by walls, but by the unwritten codes of communal living, a collective understanding that, even in closeness, there were moments that belonged only to. In such conditions, acts of love were woven gently into the folds of routine, carried out in the hush of night, when others were drifting into slumber or pretending not to hear. There were no doors to close or locks to turn, and so intimacy had to find its place within the fabric of shared existence. Quietly, respectfully, and always with a careful awareness of the space. A glance across the fire, the brush of a hand when passing a bowl, the shared laughter over a softly spoken jest. These were the small threads that began to weave affection between two souls in a setting where overt romance would have seemed out of place. It was not the kind of love that burst into flame, but the kind that warmed slowly, like embers nurtured over time. Children, sleeping nearby, would learn not from instruction but by quiet observation, from the body language of parents, the teasing words exchanged between neighbors, the way a woman might lean into the man she favored, or the way a man would quietly carve a brooch for the woman he hoped to marry. Love and intimacy were not abstract ideas, but everyday truths, visible in the care with which clothes were mended, the shared labor of hauling water, the gentle way one partner would tuck the furs around the other when the cold crept in unexpectedly. These were not grand gestures, but deeply intimate ones, made more profound by their subtlety. Privacy, as it is understood today, was a luxury the Vikings did not possess, nor did they often crave it. The concept of individuality had little place in a culture that prized kinship, reputation, and shared labor above all. A person's life was lived in full view of their household, their village, their gods, and their ancestors. And within that view, love found its own kind of freedom. To lie with one's partner under a blanket of furs while snow pressed gently against the roof was not shameful or hidden, but part of life's natural rhythm, expected, accepted, and even sacred in its way. As with everything in Viking life, there was balance between public and private, duty and desire, survival and affection. Love, when it came, had to adapt to the setting, to the shared breath of a crowded house, the cries of a child waking at night, the creaking of beams overhead. But in adapting, it did not wither, it deepened. What was not spoken aloud could still be felt in the quiet way two people moved around each other, in the ease of shared chores, or the hush of early morning, when eyes met across a dimly glowing hearth. So while modern minds may wonder how intimacy was possible in such close quarters, the Vikings knew something many have forgotten: that love does not need silence or solitude to thrive. Sometimes it grows best in the hum of daily life, in the shared space between breaths, and in the tender resilience of those who learn to love not in secret, but in full view of the world. And as that fire burned low and the night stretched on, it was often in this closeness that the earliest signs of courtship began to unfold. Not with declaration, but with a look, a favor offered, or a moment of laughter exchanged when the world was not watching. It was within these gentle exchanges, the lingering glance, the shared laughter, the passing of a wooden cup, or the quiet offered help with a heavy task, that the path of courtship began, meandering not with haste, but with the slow certainty of a stream carving its way through stone. In Viking society, affection between men and women was shaped not only by personal feeling, but by a larger structure of social roles, customs, and expectations, invisible but powerful currents that guided how love was kindled, pursued, and eventually bound into the sacred threads of marriage. From the very beginning of their lives, boys and girls were not treated the same. Not because one was seen as less than the other, but because their futures, in the eyes of society, carried different weights and responsibilities. Boys, growing up under the shadows of carved beams and warrior tales, were expected to learn the arts of endurance, loyalty, labor, and when needed, war. They learned from their fathers the skills of farming, crafting, sailing, and defending the home, while also absorbing the codes of honor that defined what it meant to be a man among Norse people. Strength was praised, yes, but so too was reliability, fairness, and the quiet strength to provide. Girls, meanwhile, were guided along a path equally demanding, though its strength lay in subtlety rather than force. They watched their mothers prepare meals, tend to the sick, manage the household, spin wool into thread, and maintain the balance of supplies that kept everyone fed and warm. But a Viking woman was not merely a domestic figure. She was expected to be sharp, decisive, and strong of will, for she often managed the household alone when men were away at sea. A woman's role included stewardship of land, protection of family honor, and in many cases, handling the family's finances or negotiating marriages, her mind as valuable as her hands. In this cultural structure, affection was neither frivolous nor wholly romanticized. Love, as it was understood, had to coexist with duty. A young man might admire a girl from a neighboring village, notice the way she braided her hair or how her laugh rose above the sounds of the marketplace, but admiration alone did not justify pursuit. A man was expected to show he was worthy, not just with words, but with deeds, reputation, and respect for tradition. The community, ever watchful, would notice how he behaved, whether he held his tongue in arguments, whether he worked without complaint, whether he brought honor to his family. Courtship began with offerings, not of flowers or poems, but of assistance, tools, crafted items, or favors granted without expectation. A carved comb, a polished bead, a knife with a bone handle. These might be presented with modesty and left in the hands of the girl's father or brother as a quiet signal of interest. Conversation was careful, respectful. There were no brash declarations in the public square, no sweeping gestures. Love, like all things in Viking society, was tied to the land, to the sea, to the bloodlines and the ancestors who watched from beyond. To court someone was to court not just an individual, but their entire family, and by extension, the gods who guarded them. And for the woman, Though she might be the recipient of these attentions, she was not passive. In many cases, Viking women had the final say in whether a match would be allowed. Though fathers and brothers played a role in negotiation, the will of the woman herself was powerful, and a man who ignored it risked more than rejection. He risked shame. Women were raised to be discerning, to watch how a man held himself, how he spoke to elders, how he treated animals or children, and how he responded to setbacks. These observations mattered more than wealth, for they revealed character, and character was the root of trust. In the smaller settlements, where families were closely intertwined and gossip traveled like fire on wind, discretion was essential. A touch of the hand in passing, a smile exchanged while drawing water, an invitation to walk together after chores. These were the early steps in a dance as old as the mountains. The boundaries were known, and stepping too boldly could stain reputations. Yet, for those who were careful, who moved within the rhythm of custom, a courtship could grow slowly, like moss across stone, unnoticed at first, but ever-present and gently deepening. Certain days in the calendar gave young couples more freedom: festivals, feast days, and market gatherings. On these days, young men and women mingled more openly. Songs were sung, food was shared, and sometimes games were played, contests of strength or cleverness that offered a light-hearted way to show off one's skills. During such moments, it was not uncommon for eyes to meet more boldly, for the veil of social restraint to lift slightly, just enough to hint at what words could not yet express. And still, everything was done with awareness, with care, for these were communities bound by memory and judgment, where every action became part of a long collective story. There were tales told by the elders, too, warnings wrapped in story, about the risks of rushing into union without proper respect. A rash lover might find themselves shamed or worse, caught in the grip of scandal that damaged not just their future, but that of their kin. Honor was a shared resource, as valuable as grain or cattle, and to stain it was to invite hardship for all. And so, restraint was not simply cultural, it was practical. Yet this restraint, rather than stifling love, gave it structure, space, and time to take root. In such an environment, the act of falling in love became not only a personal experience, but a social responsibility. Affection was a balance of longing and patience, of desire and discretion. When a couple eventually came together, when their families approved and the bond was allowed to deepen, it was not sudden. It had been growing for months, perhaps even years, in soft glances, in shared chores, in silent loyalty, and the approval of elders. And when it came to fruition, it felt not like a surprise, but like something the community had been gently guiding into place all along. So it was that Viking courtship was a process of slow weaving, a tapestry made not of impulsive passion, but threads laid one at a time, across seasons, across shared work, across the invisible yet deeply felt currents of tradition and trust. A love built in this way was seen not as a spark, but as a fire carefully tended, enduring, steady, and meant to last through storms, war, and winter alike. When such a bond was fully formed and a match agreed upon, the families would begin to prepare the way toward marriage, a ceremony not only of union between two hearts, but of alliance, honor, and shared future between two clans. Though courtship unfolded with patience and restraint, one's affection had grown into something understood and accepted, not only by the couple but by their families and the wider community. It stepped softly into a new phase, one marked by ritual, tradition, and subtle yet meaningful acts that helped solidify the bond between two people. These rituals of courting were not hastily assembled or informally practiced, but were woven into the very culture of the Viking world, passed down from elders to children, refined over generations, and carried out with a solemnity that only comes from deep ancestral weight. There was at the heart of Viking courtship a reverence for balance, a recognition that love, while deeply personal, was never entirely private. It was a matter not only of the heart, but of kin, of land, of obligation, and legacy. And so, even in the early stages of courtship, symbolic acts were required, quiet gestures that announced intention and invited a structured kind of closeness. A young man, having observed the customs and waited for the right season, might present a gift to the woman he admired. But this offering was more than a token. It was a signal, rich with meaning. A brooch, carved bone ornament, spindle whorl, or small tool, each object chosen carefully, sometimes inscribed with runes or knotted with strands of dyed wool, signifying not just affection but capability, craftsmanship, and thoughtfulness. These gifts were never extravagant, but always deliberate. To give too much would suggest arrogance or an attempt to buy favor. To give too little would signal carelessness. A gift, given in the right spirit and received without rejection, opened a space in which the courtship could proceed, not as a promise, but as an invitation. And when the woman accepted, not just a gift but the gesture itself, the next layer of custom began to unfold, slowly and gently, like frost melting beneath the spring sun. Words, while important, were used with care. Viking culture did not lean toward excessive flattery or poetic courtship, as some later medieval traditions would. Instead, intention was shown through consistent behavior, loyalty, generosity, attentiveness, and, when appropriate, defense of honor. If another suitor appeared and challenged a man standing, it was not uncommon for words to escalate into action. Not necessarily violent, but symbolic, like a strength contest or a public challenge of wit. These contests were part of culture, woven into feasts, marketplaces, and seasonal gatherings. It was during these communal events that affection could step briefly into the light, under the watchful eyes of families, neighbors, and gods. Still, discretion remained key. While the bond between two people began to form in plain view, there remained an unspoken agreement to maintain modesty and propriety, especially in public. Touches were rare and meaningful. A hand on the forearm while speaking, a shared glance while exchanging goods, a smile held a second longer than required. These subtle gestures carried weight, allowing two people to acknowledge what was forming between them without shattering the sacred calm of community life. A courtship had to build like a song. Quiet at first, slowly layering until it found its melody, and eventually its chorus. Parents, particularly the mother of the woman and the father of the man, would often begin quiet conversations once it became clear that the interest was mutual and respectable. These conversations were not confrontational but exploratory, feeling out intentions, gathering impressions, speaking to relatives or elders who might have watched the two over time. In many cases, uncles or elder cousins would be brought in to offer guidance or lend their voices to the early discussions, for it was well known that a marriage built on unstable ground could disturb not only households, but entire clans. Even among families of modest means, alliances mattered. A courtship was, in essence, the first step toward a union that had to balance emotional affection with practical advantage. Land, livestock, debts, inheritance, and lineage were all considered, not coldly, but with the understanding that love alone, though vital, could not warm a household or protect a lineage. And so, when two people truly desired to be together, their relationship had to pass through this fire of community scrutiny, not to destroy it, but to temper it, to forge it into something solid enough to last. In certain regions and among certain families, symbolic acts might be included to test the strength of the match. A woman might give a man a small piece of cloth she had woven herself, tied around a charm or pinned into his cloak. A quiet promise, visible only to those who understood its meaning. A man might carve a rune-inscribed pendant and ask her to wear it close to her skin, a sign of deepening trust. These tokens were not only romantic but spiritual, connected to the old beliefs that love, like luck or fate, could be influenced by the gods, and that the giving of meaningful objects could bind one's intentions to the wider fabric of fate. The elders would often tell stories of failed courtships, of matches where honor had been disregarded, where haste had led to shame, or where the gods had sent ill omens that were ignored. These stories were not told to frighten the young, but to remind them the sacred nature of choosing a life partner, and to emphasize that love, though beautiful, must also be rooted in care, patience, and wisdom. And so, in the flickering light of the hearth, or around the fires at festival time, the younger generation listened and remembered, shaping their own paths slowly with these lessons in mind. As time passed and a courtship matured, the two would begin to be seen more openly together, walking along the edge of the field, tending animals side by side, or sitting near each other during gatherings. Whispers would pass through the hall, but these were not unkind. A proper courtship was a thing to be encouraged, to be noted with pride by the families involved. And in these final stages of courting, the young couple would often speak more freely, make plans, and discuss their hopes, not just for each other, but for the life they might build, how many sheep they might raise, what kind of land they hoped to till, how many children they dreamed of having, or what part of the village they wished to live in. These soft, quiet dreams whispered beneath the boughs of trees or in the hush of twilight were, in many ways, the truest form of courtship, not performances for the village, but reflections of trust being planted, watered, and carefully tended. There was no rush, only the steady passage of time, and the understanding that if the bond was real, it would survive scrutiny, obligation, and the long months of preparation still to come. Because once the rituals of courting were complete, and once the families had given their blessing, the young lovers would step into the next sacred chapter of their union, the formal arrangement of marriage itself, where hearts would be joined not only in love, but in legacy. And so it was that these unions, formed by law, maintained by custom, and navigated with as much tenderness as the time could afford, became the foundation upon which Viking households rose and lives unfolded, one sunrise and one harvest at a time. The rituals of marriage, now completed, opened the door not only to shared work and joined fortunes, but to an entire realm of physical intimacy, a topic rarely spoken of in public, but deeply known in private, understood through unspoken rhythms passed down across generations by gesture, by instinct, and by the hush of candlelight in long houses shuttered against the winds. For while Viking society was, in many ways, coarse and brutal by modern standards, with its sword oaths, blood feuds, and raiding ships gliding silently across icy fjords, it was also a place where human closeness mattered, where the long, dark months demanded a warmth not only of fire but flesh, and where the body, strong and tested by labor and weather, found rest in the arms of another. Yet this intimacy was not always a thing of soft poetry or whispered declarations. In many homes, the act of lovemaking was as much a function of duty as a desire, a rhythm echoing the demands of fertility and family continuation, encouraged by elders who watched eagerly for signs of swelling bellies and growing lineages. Sex, in the Viking world, did not exist in a vacuum of pleasure. It was nestled tightly into the matrix of social obligation, religious belief, and practical necessity. A married couple was expected to try for children soon after their union, and though affection was often present, it was not a required ingredient in the recipe for physical closeness. Rather, sex was a fact of life, a nightly exchange beneath woolen blankets on bedding made of straw and fur, where the sound of the farm or hearth might mingle with the creak of wooden frames and the whisper of breath. There was no room for inhibition, only the inevitable return of nature's call and the acknowledgement of one's role in sustaining the clan. In this shared world, privacy was a scarce luxury. Most families slept in a single room, partitioned at best by hanging drapes or strategically arranged furnishings. The newly married might curl up in a corner near the hearth, surrounded by the sound of their kin, children stirring in sleep, old parents coughing the night, dogs shuffling at the threshold. Under these conditions, sex became both ordinary and necessary, a part of life as integral as bread or milk, to be neither glorified nor hidden, but simply woven into the cycle of each day. There were, of course, differences in how men and women experienced this physical connection. A man might come to bed with the expectations granted to him by culture and strength, assuming the role of leader even in the realm of touch. A woman, meanwhile, would navigate her own expectations, trained by the examples of mothers and grandmothers, and perhaps coached in quiet tones by older married women who had learned through years of experience what it meant to manage both pleasure and responsibility in equal measure. And yet, within this dynamic, there was space for kindness. Viking poetry, where it survived, often hinted at love and longing, at the tenderness of a woman's embrace, or the memory of a man's warmth before he left for sea. These fragments speak not just of physicality, but of intimacy, of the aching quiet that follows closeness when one partner departs into the unknown. And while most Vikings may never have written a love letter or composed a sonnet, their actions told stories of desire and yearning just as profound. A carved comb left behind on a bedside table, a woven belt exchanged in secret, a gentle squeeze of the hand before a journey. These are the love notes of their time, written not in ink but in gesture. And just as sex was part of life, so too was longing and its counterpart, loneliness. Especially for women whose husbands might vanish for months or years on raids, the absence of touch could become a quiet ache, filled only by the routine of life, the warmth of children, or, in some cases, a whispered comfort shared with another left behind. Adultery, while deeply frowned upon in most sagas and legal codes, was not unknown. Human longing, after all, is not bound by law. In some regions, the sagas recount tales of secret lovers, of stolen kisses beneath the moonlight, or of women whose loneliness drove them to seek comfort outside their unions. Punishments varied, sometimes social scorn, sometimes fines, and in extreme cases, harsher retributions. But the human heart continued to wander nonetheless, chasing closeness even when it came at a price. It is in these tensions between duty and desire, between what was expected and what was craved, that we catch the most human glimpses of the Vikings, not as warriors or mythic figures, but as people shaped by the same yearnings that hum softly within us even today. As seasons turned and marriages endured, sometimes outlasting love, sometimes growing into it, the rhythms of the bedroom followed the rhythms of the land. There were times of fervor, after successful harvests, during long winter nights, or upon safe returns from dangerous voyages. And there were times of silence, shaped by illness, sorrow, or grief. Through it all, physical connection remained an anchor, a reassurance that in a world of uncertainty and storm, there was still warmth to be found in the press of skin, in the shelter of another's arms, and in the silent knowledge that for night at least, neither would sleep alone. And so, in this world of woven wool and flickering firelight, Viking intimacy persisted. Not always romantic, not always ideal, but deeply human. It was neither shameful nor glorified, simply accepted as a part of life's design, necessary and enduring. With each passing night, as embers faded to ash and silence returned to the longhouse, couples lay close, the sounds of the world muted beneath their breathing, preparing to rise once more with the dawn and begin again. In a world where social bonds were everything and survival depended as much on alliances as on strength, the act of choosing a spouse in Viking society was never just a personal matter. It was a family strategy, often carefully negotiated through conversations that unfolded slowly by the hearth, between mouthfuls of porridge or tankards of mead, with elders weighing lineage and prospects like a weaver comparing threads for strength and color. These arrangements were not seen as constraints, but rather as time-honored traditions that connected individuals to their community, ensuring that the children of such unions would not only be strong in limb, but also rich in ancestry, carrying names and bloodlines that mattered greatly to those who saw family history as the only real legacy worth preserving. A father, for example, might sit beside his son beneath the sloped beams of their longhouse and speak not romance, but the sturdy hands of the girl from the next farm, or the intelligence of a second cousin whose kin had once sailed with kings. The decision would seem less like a romantic leap and more like planting a tree, quiet, firm, deliberate, and meant to last through wind and frost alike. And yet, even within this framework of expectation and agreement, there was often space for a subtle kind of affection to grow, because the Vikings understood that cooperation and shared labor could bloom into trust, and trust, when carefully tended, might turn into a deep and quiet love that did not need grand proclamations to be real. Still, the customs of betrothal followed a strict course. Gifts were exchanged, not only between a couple but between families. Rings of bronze or silver, swords and axes, or cows and sheep, depending on the status of those involved, all meant to show seriousness, wealth, and intent. There was ceremony too, but it rarely came with lavish spectacle. Instead, it was rooted in repetition and reverence for the old ways. Oaths were sworn over ancestral stones or sacred trees, and hands were clasped not just as gestures of intimacy, but as symbols of vows that extended beyond the two people involved, rippling out to affect everyone bound to them by kin or duty. And while these unions were often arranged with care and foresight, they were not necessarily cold or unfeeling, for the Vikings understood that harmony in the home mattered as much as valor in the field. A wife was not merely a decorative figure to be paraded or praised in song. She was expected to take charge of the household, to command the servants, to store the harvest, and to unlock the heavy chest where the family's silver was kept. In return, a husband provided strength, protection, and name. There was a balance to the arrangement, a mutual respect that might, over time, deepen into something more profound than passion. The sense of partnership forged through long winters, shared burdens, and the quiet companionship that only comes from walking the same path for many years together. Still, not all betrothals were welcomed equally. Sometimes, a heart would rebel against a match chosen by wiser heads, and then there might be whispered meetings in barns or hurried glances across market stalls. These secret affections, though often doomed, added a layer of human complexity to an otherwise pragmatic process. And while the laws permitted little room for elopement or disobedience, the sagas are filled with tales of love strong enough to challenge custom, even if they often ended in exile, blood, or tragedy. Yet, these stories endure precisely because they were rare, for the vast majority of unions followed the expected course, with emotions growing slowly, like moss upon stone, steady, resilient, and quietly enduring. And so, before the wedding feast could be prepared or the drinking horns filled, there would come the long discussions, the weighing of names, the counting of cattle, and the cautious smiles exchanged under watchful eyes. It was not just a joining of two people, but of two families, two fortunes, two strands in the great weave of Viking society. When the day finally arrived, it would begin not with trumpets or drums, but with the steady sounds of footsteps on packed earth and the soft rustle of woolen cloaks, as neighbors gathered to witness what they knew was not just the start of marriage, but the renewal of the community's strength, one carefully chosen union at a time. And from these unions, from these oaths whispered in candlelight and sealed with shared bread and mead, would come the quiet rhythm of married life, a rhythm that we shall now drift into, as we step gently into the world of the Viking marital home. Once the ceremonial feast had faded and the final echoes of laughter had been swallowed by the thick walls of the longhouse, life for a married Viking couple settled into a daily rhythm that was neither grand nor poetic, but deeply purposeful, like the slow turning of a grindstone, steady and essential. Their shared days unfolded in a pattern shaped by season and necessity, where each task, no matter how small, was part of the great and endless labor of surviving the northern world's stern embrace. The hearth fire was the first companion of the morning and the last to die at night, its glow warming not just flesh but the very soul of the household, anchoring the family in a space where stories, meals, and dreams quietly gathered. Within the thick timber walls, the roles of husband and wife were clear but not rigidly unyielding. They overlapped when needed, because life was too fragile and the winters too long for pride to stand in the way of practicality. The woman, often the quiet commander of the domestic sphere, would rise before dawn, her breath visible in the morning chill as she stirred the porridge, milked the animals, and directed the servants or children with a soft firmness that came from experience, not volume. Her responsibilities went far beyond cooking and sewing, for she held the keys to the household chest, managed trade goods, arranged guesting needs, and ensured that nothing was wasted or forgotten. In many ways, she was the beating heart of the home, her presence steady and unfailing like the pulse of the sea tides beyond the fjord. Her hands, though calloused, were respected, for they preserved life just as surely as any warrior's blade protected it. Her husband, in turn, might be away for long stretches, plowing fields in warmer months, repairing fences, chopping wood in the forest edge, or venturing out to sea in pursuit of fish or trade. But when he was home, his work was no less endless. He maintained the tools, mended the roof beams, trained the sons in bow and blade, and sometimes in quiet moments sat by the hearth carving wooden toys or sharpening an axe as his children watched with wide eyes and silent reverence. He rarely spoke affection in words, but his presence was its own language. His readiness to shoulder burdens, to keep the coal from the door, to fix what broke, and to defend what mattered. And yet, it was in the silences between duties where their bond often deepened. In the shared glance over a steaming bowl of stew, in the passing of wool from one hand to another, in the comfort of a shoulder beside yours while the wind howled beyond the door. These were the subtle languages of Viking marriage. There were no great declarations or passionate ballads sung beside the fire, but there was trust, familiarity, and a deep-rooted understanding that they were two halves of a single endeavor, holding back the cold, the hunger, and the chaos together. Their love, if one could call it that in the modern sense, was less about feeling and more about function, though not devoid of tenderness. It was a kind of love that watched the other's hands and knew when they were tired, that noticed a limp, a cough, a missing smile, and quietly adjusted the day's rhythm to meet it. They worked in tandem, without needing to ask. When he returned from the forest soaked in rain, she would already have a dry tunic waiting. When she coughed at dawn, he would stoke the fire and warm her broth. It was a dance learned not through poetry, but through repetition. Children, when they came, added another layer to the rhythm. Small voices and tiny feet echoing in the longhouse, questions asked with bright eyes and sticky fingers tugging at cloaks. Their presence both strained and sweetened the union, For now, the couple's efforts extended beyond each other to a new generation, and with it came joy, exhaustion, and the weighty knowledge that everything they did, every stitch sewn, every log chopped, every wound endured, was for the children's survival. And so together, they continued the rhythm of their lives, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary and right. The Viking home was not a palace, and the married life was not filled with grandeur, but it was a small world built from trust, effort, and quiet companionship, weathering the seasons like a sturdy ship upon a rough sea. And now, with the slow pulse of this domestic life established, we step deeper still into the spaces within the Viking household to explore the structure and soul of the home itself, the sacred center of life, memory, and tradition. The longhouse stood as the beating heart of Viking domestic life, not merely a building, but a vessel of warmth, memory, and daily survival, shaped by the seasons, the family's needs, and the slow passage of time that etched itself into every beam of wood and stone of the foundation. Built from sturdy timber hewn from nearby forests and insulated with turf or clay to guard against the icy grip of northern winds, the longhouse was as practical as it was symbolic, an enduring emblem of unity, resilience, and interwoven lives bound together beneath a single roof. Its elongated structure often stretched more than 20 or 30 meters, allowing ample room for animals and humans alike, separated not by walls but by understanding, as the central hearth sent out waves of flickering warmth that touched every corner, dancing upon the smoke-darkened rafters overhead like restless spirits. Inside, the air was dense with the scent of peat smoke, mingled with the faint musk of wool and salted fish, and on colder nights the occasional bleat of a goat or shuffle of a sleeping pig might stir from the animal pen near the far end of the hall. For during the harshest months, the longhouse became not only a place for sleeping and eating, but a shelter for livestock, prized and protected. The floor was packed earth, worn smooth by generations of footsteps, while the walls were lined with low wooden platforms, raised beds shared by couples' children or elderly kin, cushioned with animal skins and straw-stuffed mattresses, coarse and humble, but better than the cold ground outside. Above the hearth, smoke curled steadily upward, escaping through a small opening in the roof, but never entirely, for the smoky haze served an unspoken purpose. It kept insect at bay, preserved meat hung from rafters, and lent the space a dreamlike heaviness, as if each breath drawn was steeped in centuries of history and kinship. Daily life unfolded around this hearth in quiet, rhythmic patterns, a mother spinning beside the firelight, her spindle turning slowly between calloused fingers, while a daughter crushed dried herbs for healing balms, whispering what her grandmother once told her about nettle leaves and the sting of fever. A father carved a handle for a blade, humming low and tuneless as the blade of his small knife scraped curls in the wood, and a boy peeked over his shoulder, learning not by instruction but by imitation, as so many had before. Meals were simple and hearty, brewed from barley, salted meat, root vegetables, and fish pulled from icy waters. Each meal a ritual of gratitude, however quiet, for what the land and sea had yielded. Horn spoons dipped into communal bowls, and hands tore bread and passed it silently from one to the next, the fire crackling as if in approval, and above all, the longhouse thrummed with the soft harmony of mutual dependence, every task, no matter how small, serving the wholeness of the household. In this dim interior, privacy was not expected, for the concept itself barely existed as it does now. The flickering shadows were the only barriers between bodies, and yet a mutual respect allowed for moments of intimacy to unfold with quiet grace. When night fell, couples curled beneath cloaks and furs, their whispers lost in the lull of other breathers nearby, and even in such closeness, a sense of modesty lingered. It was understood that life was communal, that boundaries were made not by walls but by awareness, and so averted eyes and quiet voices stood in for doors that didn't exist. Even in matters of physical affection, there was a rhythm to how one moved, how one spoke, how one waited for the right time, the right space within the fabric of the shared home. Children drifted asleep listening to the voice of a grandfather reciting half-remembered sagas, tales of great voyages, of dragons and shield maidens, of gods who walked among men, and tricksters who stole the sun. Stories shaped not by written word, but by memory, passed down beside this very same hearth. The embers glowed a dim orange as the night grew deep, and the fire's warmth faded only to rise again at dawn, sparked by hands that knew the rhythm of survival. Every person in the household had their role, and their presence helped hold up the structure both literally and figuratively. For without each other, the house would become nothing but timber and turf. There were no mirrors within the longhouse walls, no polished surfaces to reflect one's image. And so people came to know themselves not by appearance, but by reputation, by the weight of their deeds and the sound of their names spoken by others. A girl knew she was kind because her mother said she had gentle hands. A boy knew he was brave because he dared to walk the icy path alone to gather water before dawn. These small affirmations build identity, and the glow of that shared life. People became defined not by isolation but by interconnection, each thread weaving into the others until the tapestry of the household was complete. In the darkest part of winter, when the sun lingered only for a short time and snow piled high outside the door, the long house became a fortress of warmth and memory, and even the longest nights passed in the comfort of shared breath and steady hearts. There were games played with carved bone pieces, songs hummed low as the wind howled just beyond the turf walls, and the occasional soft laughter that warmed the soul more than any fire. It was in these moments, quiet and unremarkable to the outside world, that Viking families found their deepest connection. Not through grand battles or voyages, but in the slow pulse of ordinary life, repeated night after night, year after year. And when spring finally returned and the world beyond the door turned green again, the people of the longhouse stepped out into a world that had changed subtly, as they themselves had changed, carrying forward the memories of long nights spent beside one another, wrapped in smoke and stories and the sound of their own breath. And so the longhouse remained a vessel not only of shelter, but of story, tradition, and memory, a quiet witness to each private glance exchanged in firelight, to each touch that passed beneath the firs when the world outside was cloaked in frost. It was here that bonds were formed not in haste, but over seasons and sowings, and as these connections deepened into something stronger than curiosity, the village would prepare for one of the most significant passages in the life of its people, the solemn and celebratory ritual of Viking marriage. Unlike the modern vision of marriage bathed in flowers and candlelight, the Viking understanding of union was built first and foremost upon practicalities, and yet it was not without a certain poetry. It began with an agreement, usually struck between families, long before the actual wedding rites, where fathers and kinsmen would gather to discuss the merging of not just individuals, but estates, cattle, dowries, and future alliances. It was less about hearts and more about households. And yet, beneath this exchange of promises and property, there existed an undercurrent of deep cultural reverence for the sacred responsibility of bringing two lineages together in rightful harmony. The betrothal was its own occasion, a gathering of both families, not unlike the weddings themselves, marked with feasting and storytelling, where oaths were spoken and hands were shaken in front of witnesses who understood the weight of words spoken to meet fueled sincerity. The bride price, known as mund, would be presented by the groom's family. A token of wealth or livestock meant not to purchase the bride, but to honor her worth and affirm the groom's ability to support her. And in return, the bride's family would often offer a dowry or hymenophilia, household goods, land, or wealth she could bring into the union, a kind of early insurance against the unknown future. The actual wedding could take place weeks or even months later, timed carefully with the seasons, so that travel, farming, and rituals could unfold with ease and abundance. Autumn, with its harvests and hearts, was often preferred, as was spring, with its quiet promises and thawing earth. The location varied, sometimes within the longhouse itself, sometimes beneath open skies beside ancient stones or sacred groves, depending on the customs of the clan and the spiritual leanings of the community. When the day arrived, the bride would be prepared with reverence, her hair woven with care, often crowned with circlet metal or adorned with her family's heirloom brooches. She might wear a dress of finely spun wool dyed in deep greens or soft blues, clasped at the shoulders with silver fasteners etched with animal runes, while the groom would arrive dressed not for battle, but for commitment, in clean tunics and belts, perhaps with sword at his side not for fighting, but for symbolism. That blade might be handed to his new wife during the ceremony, a gesture signifying trust and protection, a quiet promise forged in steel rather than words. A priest or gothi, if present, would preside over the ceremony, calling upon the gods, Odin for wisdom, Frigg for home, Freya for love and fertility, though sometimes the rites were led simply by the elders of the household or community. Hands might be joined over a sword or bound in cloth, a ritual called hand fasting, while offerings were made to the land and ancestors. There would be shared drinking, often from a ceremonial horn, symbolizing unity, and food would be passed among guests, the beginning of a feast that could stretch deep into the night, carried by laughter, riddles, and stories older than memory. The first night of the union carried its own traditions, cloaked in both privacy and expectation. In some cases, the community would escort the couple to the bridal bed with gentle teasing and ceremonial song, a practice designed not to invade but to bless the union. In others, the new couple would slip away from the revelry into the darkened warmth of their new shared space, the firelight flickering against walls now familiar, now shared. Sex, in the context of this first night, was seen not just as an act of desire, but as a completion of the contract, a sacred sealing of the oaths spoken by the families and the gods alike. It was believed that the strength of a marriage and its ability to bring forth healthy children depended on the balance of honesty, respect, and compatibility shared between the two who now lay side by side. And though love was not always present on the first night, it was not absent from a marriage altogether. It often grew slowly, like a flame nurtured through the seasons, especially if the union was guided by patience, shared burdens, and mutual regard. In some traditions, tokens from the wedding night would be preserved, a sheet, a comb, a braid of hair, and stored in chests beside family heirlooms, a quiet reminder of where the union began. These items, like the rings of trees or the faded carvings on wood, would one day be touched by children or grandchildren, their meaning softened by time but never lost. The morning after, the couple would rejoin the community not as separate threads but as a woven strand, now part of the broader tapestry of village life, expected to build a home, tend a hearth, and continue the lineage that had carried them this far. And it was within this new framework of shared life that the deeper aspects of Viking intimacy would begin to unfold, not in fleeting moments of passion, but in the steady rhythm of a life built together. A hand was given not only in gesture, but in trust, a promise exchanged beneath watching eyes and sacred fires that would burn long into the night, casting shadows upon the woven reed mats and carved beams, as two lives began to settle slowly into one. The wedding itself, a turning point marked not just by ceremony but by ancestral echoes, held its place at the center of Viking life with a weight that few events could rival. It was not simply a matter of celebration or union, but a moment of realignment, when two family lines braided themselves together in both obligation and opportunity, ensuring that land, wealth, and kinship remained properly rooted in soil and story alike. Viking weddings were never casual affairs, for they bore the weight of entire communities and the judgment of those who had come before. Arranged carefully, often months, if not years in advance, they were transactions of both affection and utility, not devoid of feeling, but balanced between passion and prudence. When the day finally arrived, it was rarely quiet. Villagers gathered, sometimes for days, sometimes for a full week, bringing with them offerings of mead, game, and grain. Songs were sung, drums pounded rhythmically in the wind, and torches lit the long summer dusk until it gave way to twilight. The bride was adorned not in white lace, but in woven wool and fine linen, dyed with plant-based hues that reflected her family's means. Amber beads clinked softly at her neck, and a ring of keys hung from her belt. Not just an ornament, but a symbol of her coming authority over the new household she would soon manage. Yet behind the feasting, the drinking, and the raised horns of ale, deeper rituals unfolded. At the heart of Viking matrimony lay the invocation of the gods, the calling upon Freya, goddess of fertility and sensuality, and Frigg, guardian of marriage and the hearth. Priests or Gothi would chant softly near the altar, which might be a carved stone outside or a wooden table within the hall, depending on the season. A blood offering, was not always present, but when it was, the animal sacrifice was usually a boar or goat, a symbolic gift to ensure fertility and good favor. These were moments heavy with meaning, observed not only by kin but by spirits, ancestors, and the very forces of nature that the Vikings believed could twist fate if displeased. And then came the procession, the formal, symbolic transfer of the bride from her father's house to her new husband's home. She was escorted by torchlight, often accompanied by women singing old ballads, their voices low and slow like the tide, calling forth generations of similar walks made before. At the door of the groom's longhouse, she would remove her cranson, a maiden's crown, and set it aside never to wear it again. In exchange, she was given a new headdress, often more elaborate, signify her new role. Stepping across the threshold was not a casual act. It was a declaration of transformation, a passage from one identity to another. Inside, the hearth glowed warmly, tended carefully by the mother or sister of the groom. Fire was a central figure in Viking belief, representing both protection and transition. As the couple sat side by side for the first time, they would share bread and salt, and then drink from a single horn of mead, which had been steeped with herbs believed to inspire desire and fertility. The act of drinking was ceremonial, a shared breath, a mutual promise, a quiet act more intimate than the spoken vow. The first night together, while often imagined today through modern eyes, was handled with equal parts tradition and superstition. The bed, often curtained with wool and furs, stood in the family hall or a nearby chamber. Privacy was relative, and yet the union was considered sacred, not for others to witness, but still bound by community. The expectation was that this night would begin the work of future generations, that it would plant the seed of continuity. But for many Viking couples, it was also a night of learning the rhythm of another's body, the quiet language of touch and breath, the small nervous laughter that sometimes bloomed in the dark, and the long silences that followed when breath slowed and fingers curled softly against skin. It wasn't always tender. Not every match was filled with mutual longing. Some pairings were uneasy, awkward, even cold. Yet for others, there was warmth, perhaps even joy. The shy glance across the fire now unfolding into hesitant exploration, a long-held curiosity now allowed expression, and the weight of expectation giving way to the gentler work of understanding another person not only as partner, but as presence, as rhythm, as shape. As morning came, no grand announcement was made. The fire burned low, and life resumed its cycle. Bread was kneaded, goats were milked, and neighbors returned to their homes. But within the longhouse, something subtle had changed, not only in the identities of the bride and groom, now husband and wife, but in the energy of the home itself. A new union had taken root, quietly, deeply, with all the hope and mystery that comes when two people, shaped by custom and kin, begin the quiet work of building something shared. And so the rituals passed into memory, and the house grew a little warmer, a little fuller, with the memory of laughter in the beams and the scent of mead still lingering faintly in the air. The days that followed, though quieter than the ceremony, were no less full of meaning, for it was in the ordinary hours that the newlywed couple began to define the shape of their shared life. One morning, one meal, one careful step at a time. As the firelight flickered in patterns across the walls and the hush of night softened the sound of the world outside, there was space enough for something rare to emerge, something unmeasured by trade or title, yet deeply valued in its own quiet way. It was in the most undramatic of moments, those which left no trace in the sagas or stones, that the emotional world of Viking couples began to show itself, not in grand declarations or sweeping romantic gestures, but in the smaller acts that passed unnoticed by all except the two who shared them. Love, to the Viking mind, was not a concept to be spoken about lightly, for words had power and the tongue could invite consequences. But feelings were not absent. They were simply shown differently, carried in the hands that mended a cloak before a long journey, in the way food was set aside without being asked, or in the glances exchanged before sleep, when all duties were done and no one else remained to see. The Viking household, though structured in hierarchy and daily expectation, still held room for tenderness, particularly between those who had lived together long enough to know one another's rhythms without needing them explained. Men, raised to be stoic and fierce in the face of the outside world, often found space in the home to let some of that steel soften. A husband might not sing poetry to his wife in the way a skald might sing to a king's daughter, but he might repair her tools in silence, fix a broken hinge on her storage chest, or stay awake to tend the fire while she slept more deeply. These things were not called love, but they were recognized as such by those who had no need for the word. Women, too, bore an emotional strength rooted in patience and observation. They watched their partners grow weary with trade, hunting, or raids, and they waited, not with demands, but with presence. In quiet moments, a woman might sit at her spindle and listen without interruption, offering her company as comfort rather than crowding him with speech. Her way of showing care was not always through what she said, but in how she allowed him to be, how she knew the day's burden before he spoke of them, and gave space for the weight to slip away in her quiet company. There were, of course, moments when deeper affection surfaced more clearly. Sometimes this came during shared laughter over a child's mischief, or in the hushed conversations exchanged before sleep about the coming harvest or the dream of a future journey. The Viking couple might sit side by side at the edge of their field and look out across their shared work with a sense of something unspoken passing between them. Not pride, perhaps, but a steady companionship built on seasons of endurance. It wasn't uncommon, either, for couples to grieve together, especially after the loss of a child or elder, and in such moments, those hardened by life's rougher trials were allowed to fold into one another like weary sails brought in from a wind. Even in more intimate acts, those kept strictly within the bounds of their shared bed. There was a rhythm of familiarity that spoke not only of desire, but of a deeper comfort rooted in years of knowing one another. These were not always fiery moments, but steady, natural, and often marked more by warmth than by heat. The understanding of what pleased one another didn't come from instruction, but from observation, memory, and time. The bed was not just a place of passion, but of peace, an island away from judgment or duty, where they could be merely two people in a world that so often demanded they be everything else. Jealousy, while present in the Viking world, was tempered by practical understanding. Relationships were sometimes tested by absences, raiding seasons, trade journeys, or political marriages. But those who returned found in their home not always the exact person they had left, but someone changed by the seasons, yet still familiar in essence. Rebuilding closeness was often a process not rushed, but allowed to happen slowly, through the routine that were resumed. Meals shared again, tools passed back and forth, clothing mended with quiet care. There were no therapists, no written books on emotional intelligence, and few songs that told of domestic comfort. But the Viking world still knew the shape of a partnership that endured. It knew the value of trust built over time, the peace of a shared silence, and the balm of presence during a hard winter. These truths did not need to be praised in public, for their worth was understood in the stillness of shared spaces and the rhythm of daily life lived side by side. And so, in the long shadows of the fire and the muffled hush of snow outside, the Viking couple curled beneath their furs not just to stay warm, but to remain tethered, to remind themselves of something lasting amid the rise and fall of tides and time. What they shared might never be carved in runes or told in story circles, but it was real, and in its quiet way it was enough. Now, as the snow fell soft upon the sod roof above and the embers glowed low on the hearth, life continued with its gentle hum, and the world outside, ever cold and wide, waited once again for morning to arrive. And while much of the social scaffolding appeared rigid at first glance, within its ancient wooden bones there was space for surprising flexibility, for moments of genuine human tenderness, for the quiet negotiations between passion and duty that whispered to the private corners of the longhouse. It was within these private corners, dimly lit by the fading flicker of oil lamps or the low burn of communal hearth, that couples, whether newly bound or long entwined, carved out their own delicate rhythms of intimacy, which were rarely spoken aloud, but which nonetheless wove through the everyday cadence of Viking life like an invisible thread. Though Norse sagas often thunder with the weight of battles, blood feuds, and divine interventions, buried within their sprawling verses are moments of softness, hints of longing, and glimpses of something not quite like our modern notion of romantic love, but no less poignant for its unfamiliar shape. These narratives, passed down by skalds who understood the power of silence just as much as song, occasionally pause in their stormy course to dwell on the quiet touch of a wife at her loom, waiting for her husband's return from distant raids, or the forlorn gaze of a man haunted by dreams of a lover he left behind on foreign shores. Such interludes were rare, but they reminded the listener that even in a world shaped by axes and oaths, the heart still beat beneath the armor, and longing could be just as sharp as a blade. Yet one must not mistake this for romantic idealism, for the Vikings, pragmatic to their bones, knew that affection alone did not sustain a household or a union. Instead, intimacy was often constructed atop a scaffolding of shared burdens and expectations, of children to rear and animals to tend, of injuries to soothe and winters to endure. There was no room for idle sentiment in the biting wind of a Norse winter, and so affection was often expressed through actions rather than declarations, in a carefully repaired cloak laid out by the hearth, in food saved from one's own portion, or in the simple presence of body beside another beneath a shared fur when the night stretched too long and the wolves howled outside. Evenings, when they came, were not always times of leisure. They were often reserved for tasks: sewing, repairing tools, storytelling, and maintaining the rhythms of a life that allowed no luxury for idleness. But within these routines, when the children had grown quiet and the elders had nodded off in their straw beds, there came a stillness, a sacred space in which whispers replaced words and glances carried more weight than entire conversations. Here, couples navigated their unspoken language of touch and closeness, developing a quiet trust that, though never named, was understood to be essential. Privacy, however, was a luxury few enjoyed fully. The longhouse, as warm as it was crowded, rarely offered complete solitude. Curtains or high partitions might provide a shadow of separation, but sounds traveled easily, and the rhythms of shared space made discretion both necessary and difficult. This did not hinder intimacy so much as transform it, reshaping it into a form both subtle and adaptable, where lovers learned to communicate without drawing attention, to steal moments of closeness between the cracks of daily life. Indeed, for some, this very challenge of proximity may have nurtured a more profound understanding, for what flourished in secret often held a sacred weight. When the world around you was small, a single shared roof, a flickering fire, a patch of earth, love had to grow quietly, humbly, weaving itself into the very grain of the timber walls and the folds of the winter blankets. And though it rarely announced itself, it was there, tucked into every shared bowl of stew, every hand wrapped around another's in the cold. What remains most striking is not the form their love took, but the fact that it endured it all amid the violence, the migrations, the expectations, and the endless toil. The Viking world was one of hardship, but also profound closeness, where bonds were tested not through flowery vows, but through life itself, through the wear of days and the hush of nights. It was this quiet, persistent devotion that allowed intimacy to thrive even in the shadows, like moss beneath stones, unnoticed by many, yet absolutely essential to the life that pressed on above. And so, from these smoky, half-lit spaces, from the beds made of straw and pelts, from the rituals of care and comfort that outlasted any wedding feast or battle song, we begin to see what Viking intimacy truly looked like. Not loud, not extravagant, but steady, thoughtful, and deeply rooted in the earthiness of their existence. If love among the Norse was forged in the fires of shared labor and quiet affection, then the fruit of such unions, the children, were both burden and blessing, hope and necessity, fragile futures wrapped in swaddling cloth and bound tightly to the cycles of land, sea, and fate. Fertility was revered not merely as a gift of the gods, but as an essential thread in the loom of survival, a sacred promise that one's name might echo beyond death and that a family line, however humble, might continue through seasons of change and hardship. In the dim interiors of the longhouse, where light filtered only weakly through the smoke hole above, new life emerged in the most ancient and human of ways. Cradled by the hands of midwives, announced by low cries, and wrapped in furs that smelled of wood smoke and salted earth. To birth a child in the Viking world was to walk the knife edge between life and death. Women, brave beyond song or saga, bore not only the pain of labor but the very real risk that either they, the child, or both might not survive the crossing from womb to world. There were no hospitals, no antiseptics, no guarantees. Instead, there was knowledge passed hand to hand, generation to generation, whispered lore of herbs, oils, warm water, and careful touch, all held by the midwives, often older women, who had seen too much and still carried on. These women were not merely caregivers. They were custodians of life's gateway, guardians of that sacred boundary between breath and stillness. When a child was born, if it survived, it was greeted not with luxury, but with ritual. The naming ceremony, held within 9 days if the infant lived that long, was both a celebration and a trial. Until that point, the child was not considered fully part of the clan, hovering instead in a liminal space, neither quite alive nor entirely accepted. This pause reflected not cruelty, but realism. For infant mortality was a ghost that lingered near every cradle, and to name too soon was to tempt the gods. But if the days passed and the baby's cries remained strong, the father would lift the child, name it aloud, and in that simple act of raising the small, fragile body into the smoke-filled air, he declared, "This one lives. This one is ours." This one will carry us forward. Names were not chosen lightly. They often honored ancestors, preserved legacy, or even invoked deities. A quiet hope that Odin might lend wisdom or Thor bestow strength. In doing so, every child became a living thread in the vast web of kinship and memory that defined Viking identity. A boy might bear the name of a warrior fallen far from home. A girl the name of a grandmother who once tamed storms of her own. And so, with each birth, the past and future met, hand in hand, in the present breath of a newborn. Childhood in the Norse world was not a long, protected affair. From the earliest days, survival depended on learning, not just stories or songs, but the skills of life. How to fish, how to carve, how to spin wool or sow barley. Little hands were set to tasks not out of cruelty, but necessity. Every member of the household, no matter how small, played a part in the rhythm of daily toil. Yet despite the labor, there was room for play. Carved wooden animals, bones used as dice, rough dolls of straw. And within these moments of joy, parents watched with pride. Siblings laughed and shared mischief, and elders smiled in memory of all the lives that had grown up under this same low roof. For all their pragmatism, the Norse were not without tenderness. A father might craft a tiny wooden toy for his daughter, carving runes into its side for protection. A mother might sing lullabies woven from myth and memory as she rocked a colicky baby beside the hearth. These small acts, unrecorded in saga or song, carried the weight of love, not the thunderous kind that reshaped kingdoms, but the quiet, steadfast devotion that built them from within. Children were the hope of lineage, yes, but also the keepers of soul and story. Elders told them tales not just to pass the time, but to pass the torch. Through myth, they learned what it meant to be brave, what it meant to endure, what it meant to belong to a people whose gods walked among them and whose dead whispered from the soil. And so a Viking child, even before he or she could walk, already bore the weight of generations, a living vessel for memory, duty, and dream. To lose a child was a wound that no song could mend, and yet such losses were part of the unspoken bargain of life. When the gods took back what they had given, there were no grand funerals for the small, only silent tears and quiet prayers, a burial beneath stones, a name spoken softly and then folded away into the fabric of remembrance. Grief in the Viking world was not always loud. Sometimes it was a father sharpening a blade in silence. Sometimes it was a mother leaving a space by the fire untouched. And yet, even in that grief, life carried on, as it always did, stubborn, aching, and full of quiet courage. Thus, in the fragile miracle of every birth, in the quiet strength of every mother, in the steady hands of the midwives and the stoic pride of fathers, we find a love more enduring than song, a love woven through risk and ritual, through laughter and loss, through the very bones of the house and the breath of the land. Yet even as her hands moved and practiced rhythms, her eyes often wandered toward the fire or the shadows beyond, as though seeing stories written there that no one else could read, stories passed down in silence from the women who came before her, and those yet to come. The deeper current beneath these traditions, flowing quietly through the very bones of Viking domestic life, was a way in which sexuality, so often imagined today as loud or savage in this warrior culture, was in reality cloaked in quiet, bound by rules both rigid and unspoken, yet not devoid of tenderness or mutual recognition. For to understand Viking intimacy is not to impose modern notions of wild indulgence upon them, but to carefully uncover the layers of expectation, of shared duty and hidden vulnerability that shaped their closest physical moments. The act itself, far from being taboo, was accepted as a natural part of life, acknowledged without shame yet rarely flaunted, folded into the larger rhythms of marriage, family, fertility, and fate. Most encounters between partners occurred not in solitude, but in the crowded reality of longhouse life, where privacy was a luxury reserved for the gods or the forest. A simple wooden partition or a hanging cloth might mark off a couple's space, but it did not conceal the sounds or silences that followed. This proximity meant that intimacy was not mysterious. It was ever-present, witnessed, and understood by all within a household, from elders to children, as a part of life as normal as mead drinking or sheep shearing. And because of this openness, there was less room for scandal or pretense. Instead, there was a quiet acceptance that bodies sought each other out, that life came from the joining of flesh, and that such unions, when guided by honor, could be both gentle and profound. Yet it was not merely a biological transaction. In Norse poetry and saga, when a man lay with a woman, it was often described in terms not of domination but of exchange. Words such as sharing bed or lying together spoke to mutuality. Consent, though not always equal by modern standards, was still a concept embedded in the culture, especially when it came to free women. A woman of standing could, and often did, refuse a suitor, and such refusals were not only acknowledged but sometimes immortalized in stories as signs of her wisdom or power. The gods themselves were bound by the rules of honor in matters of desire. Even the Allfather Odin, mighty as he was, sometimes failed to win a woman's favor, and when he succeeded, it was more often through cunning than brute force, though both were tools he did not hesitate to use. What might surprise the modern listener, lulled to sleep beneath their own warm covers, is how intricately sex in Viking culture was tied to storytelling. From the whispered riddles exchanged between lovers to the bawdy poems carved into ship timbers or spoken over horns of ale, sexuality was not shameful. It was something to be laughed at, sung about, and at times, even revered. But always, it was connected to lineage. A child born from such unions was not merely a mouth to feed, but potential bearer of the family name, a carrier of stories, of blood, and of vengeance if needed. To lie together was to participate in a chain that stretched back through time, from shield maiden to skald, from chieftain to farmhand, all equally human beneath the furs and the firelight. Still, while stories often soften reality, the truth was not always romantic. There were instances where sex was transactional, tied to status or survival. A bondservant might have little say, and her body might be claimed without ceremony. These darker edges existed. No society is ever without them. But what defined the Viking world was not the absence of wrongdoing, but the codes that governed it. A man who wronged a woman of standing might face fines, exile, or even blood vengeance, depending on her family's influence. And a woman wronged was not always silenced. In many sagas, she sought justice with fierceness that echoed the warrior's path. Some took to weapons, others to words, and some let their children become the instruments of their vengeance. Even within marriage, expectations were set. A man was to satisfy his wife, not just in the bearing of children, but in the bed as well. Though much of this is gleaned through poetry and legal texts rather than diaries or letters, none of which remain, it is clear that Viking men were judged by their ability to provide pleasure as much as protection. Failures in the bedchamber, especially repeated ones, could lead to gossip, shame, or even the dissolution of marriage. The Icelandic sagas speak, sometimes with startling frankness, of men mocked for their lack of virility or women praised for their appetites, especially when they wielded them wisely. Yet even in this, restraint was valued. A man who boasted too loudly of his conquests, or who chased after every skirt, was considered foolish, even dangerous. Moderation, self-control, and tact were seen as hallmarks of a good husband. The wildness of a warrior's life was expected to yield, at least somewhat, to the softness of home. The bed, like the hearth, was a place of peace, a reprieve from the chaos of raids or sea voyages. It was where sons were conceived, daughters were named, and futures were quietly dreamed beneath the flicker of firelight on wattle walls. And so, in the heart of the longhouse, among the woven blankets and carved beams, Viking lovers found each other not in the throes of mythic passion, but in the patient, practiced nearness that grew from shared winters, from laughter around the hearth, from standing side by side while hauling nets or burying kin. It was not a firestorm. It was a slow-burning ember, lasting, glowing quietly in the dark. Yet even in a society that favored strength and structure, where rules were handed down like heirlooms and community, was a woven net designed to catch the fallen before they hit the earth too hard. There remained a quiet and complicated ache that settled deep in the bones of those who had been betrayed, who had watched love curdle slowly into something cold, who had felt the sting of doubt creeping like frost under a poorly sealed door. Suspicion did not announce itself with shouts or swords. Rather, it arrived in glances withheld, in touches no longer offered, in nights spent facing opposite directions on a fur-covered bed, while fire burned low and the silence grew louder than any argument ever could. For all their openness in some aspects of sexuality, the Vikings did not treat betrayal lightly. especially when it threatened not just the individual, but the delicate web of kinship that held everything together. When a husband began to suspect his wife of taking another man to her bed, it was not only his pride that bristled, but the honor of both families, the broader connection of clan, and the expectations bound by marriage oaths that carried legal and social weight alike. Wives, too, could be wounded by betrayal, and though some might imagine that Viking women were docile or bound in silence, they had voices, rights, and the backing of their kin, who could step in when a woman's dignity had been openly trampled. These matters, of course, did not explode instantly into public scandals. More often, they simmered. A wife might quietly consult her brothers or father, speaking in hushed tones by the weaving loom, seeking not vengeance, but clarity, support, and perhaps the dignity of being heard. A husband might turn to the law speaker, a respected voice in community, who carried not only knowledge of the law, but also the moral compass of generations, for guidance on how best to proceed without letting shame darken the threshold of his home. And so the consequences of adultery, when proven, when not mere whispers in the hallways or gossip over bread dough, could be formal, clear, and at times severe. Compensation could be demanded from the offending party. A man who seduced another's wife might be ordered to pay fines in silver or goods, depending on the standing of the betrayed man and the gravity of the offense. If the act was considered a stain too deep for silver to wash clean, harsher punishments could be meted out. Exile, for instance, where the guilty party would be cast from the community, forced to roam the cold lands with nothing but regret and the silence of the trees to keep them company. In rare cases, violence erupted, not just between lovers, but between families who saw honor as a sword that could not be left to rust. Duels, though discouraged in later centuries, did occur in earlier times, especially when blood and betrayal ran hot enough to make reason tremble. But beneath these responses, whether gentle or harsh, was a true sorrow thing, the quiet unraveling of trust, which in a world so dependent on loyalty, felt heavier than any stone one could lift. And for betrayed, the ache didn't simply disappear with the clinking of silver or the banishment of a rival. It lingered. It sat like a shadow at the edge of the hearth. It colored every silence, and it sometimes transformed once bright homes into quiet hollows of what used to be. Children, too, were not immune to these shifts. They could feel the weight of sadness hanging over meals, the absence of laughter in places where it once flowed freely, and the bitterness that sometimes crept into their mother's eyes as she sewed, or their father's eyes as he returned from the field. Still, the Vikings, like any people, found ways to carry on. Some couples, bound by duty more than desire, found a way to rebuild, laying new bricks where old ones had cracked, often quietly and without fanfare. Others, however, separated, especially if no children tied them tightly together. While not common, divorce was not taboo in Viking culture. It was simply acknowledged as one possible end to a bond that had begun with hope. The process, while often difficult emotionally, could be managed with dignity and without the lifelong stigma found in some other societies. A woman could return to her family, perhaps with children in tow, and begin anew. A man might seek another match, though the memory of failure often followed in his shadow. And as time passed, so too did the sharp edges of betrayal soften, worn down by seasons, stories, and the slow rebuilding of what had been lost. For even in a world as harsh and practical as that of the Northmen, there was still space for healing, slow, imperfect, but real. The sagas may not dwell on these tender parts, preferring instead to echo with blades and vengeance, but the quiet pain of broken bonds shaped just as much of the Viking heart as the clang of sword upon shield. In long houses warmed by fire and time, some found forgiveness, while others simply learned to live beside the ghost of what once was. And in this mixture of sorrow and survival, the Viking world pressed onward, never pausing long, always stepping into the next day's frost with the strength of those who knew how to bear heavy things with silent dignity. And so, as the slow rhythm of seafaring life pulsed quietly beneath the surface of the domestic world, another layer of Viking intimacy began to unfold, not just between lovers who met beneath fur blankets or beside firelit walls, but between those who felt desire stretch out across seasons of absence and reunion, creating a different sort of bond, one forged not by constant closeness, but by the aching distance in between, a yearning that neither the sea nor time could erode. In such spaces of waiting and return, of absence and memory, The emotional landscape of Viking relationships took on subtler dimensions, for what began as touch could deepen into trust, and what once sparked as passion could settle into something slower, more sacred, more enduring. It was in this enduring bond, often woven into the silences of the hearth and the noise of the harbor, that the Vikings gave shape to their understandings of loyalty, not just as something owed between warrior and chief or between siblings born of the same mother, but also as something owed between husband and wife, between bed partners who shared not only warmth but the weight of legacy, of bloodline, of the invisible ties that stretched from cradle to grave. Loyalty in Viking culture was not a fleeting virtue. It was a bedrock, a principle written into the very structure of their households, one that extended beyond spoken vows or brief encounters beneath the stars. A wife left behind during raids or long voyages might endure loneliness, hardship, and even temptation, but her role in her husband's life, and in the future of their lineage, remained rooted in an unspoken agreement that survival itself was the truest kind of fidelity. And for the Viking men who traveled far and often, the idea of loyalty did not simply mean abstaining from the pleasures of distant lands, though some did and others did not, but rather it meant returning, always returning, with stories etched into weathered faces and longing hidden behind hardened eyes, returning not just to a house but to a person, to the part of themselves left behind with her. And yet, loyalty, like most virtues in the Viking world, was not one-dimensional. It was fluid and complicated, as real loyalty must be, and was often tested by the tides of life itself. There were sagas that spoke of betrayals, of love turned bitter, of oaths broken in the heat of ambition, or the ache of unmet desire. Wives took lovers when they believed their husbands lost, and men sometimes found comfort in foreign arms or new lands. But such stories were not told to condemn, only to remember that even in a world governed by codes and customs, the heart could still stray, and the soul could still hunger for something unnamed. Loyalty, then, was not perfection. It was persistence, the daily act of choosing to stay, to return, to keep weaving one's thread into the tapestry of shared life, even when it frayed at the edges. Among the hearth shadows of the longhouse, children often bore witness to the quiet rituals of this kind of loyalty. They saw their mothers light the hearth each evening and offer silent thanks for safe returns or whisper prayers for those still away. They saw fathers carve toys from bone or wood for sons they missed and press small trinkets into the palms of daughters they feared they might not see again. These were gestures born of a deeper bond, one that spoke not only of love but of endurance, of the willingness to bear the passage of time and the weight of separation without letting go of the one waiting on the other side of it. And in those moments of reunion, when boots met the packed earth of home again and sea-worn hands met waiting hands with a kind of reverent urgency, the act of love-making itself took on a new texture. Not the frantic spark of first lust, but the slow-burning ember of something tested and tempered by absence. It was not merely a meeting of bodies, but a rejoining of paths, of stories that had diverged for a time and were now braided back together, like strands of rope, made stronger for their time apart. The sighs exchanged then were not only those of physical pleasure, but of relief, of grounding, of knowing that the world, however wide and wild, had bent once more toward home. And it was in the silence that followed such reunions, the hush after the storm, the calm and the glow of shared breath, that the Vikings came closest to something resembling modern ideas of intimacy, not a spectacle but as sanctuary. This was not the intimacy of candles or poetry or grand romantic gestures. It was a kind that settled deep into the bones, that spoke in small touches and long silences, in shared burdens and remembered promises. It was a kind of intimacy that made space for imperfection, for growth, for forgiveness, and for the strange, quiet comfort being known, entirely honestly, without judgment. For the Vikings, such loyalty was not merely a moral expectation. It was a necessity, a survival strategy, a way to keep the family whole while the world frayed at its edges. And perhaps this is where one sees their humanity most clearly, not in their ships or swords, but in their waiting, in their returning, in their quiet acts of devotion carried out not for glory, but for one another. And as the fire burned low in those long, dark nights, and the wind rattled softly against the planks of the longhouse walls, the old, familiar rhythm of breath against breath would return. Steady, patient, rooted in the knowledge that no matter how far the sea may call, there is always something waiting to be returned to, something that holds fast even when all else drifts. And so, With every heated glance exchanged at a feast and every whispered promise beneath the twilight sky, the unspoken bonds of Viking desire pulled tighter still, reaching their most intimate crescendo in a union that followed. Yet even that final act of closeness was bound to the rhythms and beliefs that defined the Viking world, where sensuality did not exist in isolation, but as part of a larger spiritual and social fabric. In the quiet hours after the embers had dimmed and the longhouse walls exhaled their warmth back into night, Viking lovers might find themselves not only wrapped in each other's arms, but in the layered weight of myth, magic, and expectation that shaped every part of their physical lives. While to modern eyes, intimacy is often viewed through the lens of emotion, chemistry, and pleasure in Viking society, the physical relationship between a man and a woman was rarely just a private act. It was a convergence of deeply rooted ideas about fertility, ancestry, honor, and the divine. The Norse saw sex not simply as pleasure or bonding, but as a vital force, a power that linked individuals to their gods, to the health of their crops, to the strength of their kin, and even to the success of future generations. It was a sacred current running beneath the skin of their society, both feared and celebrated, and always held in respect for the mighty beings who watched from beyond the veil. One of the most striking aspects of Viking attitudes toward sexuality was how closely they associated it with fertility and cosmic balance. In Norse mythology, fertility gods like Freyr and Freya governed not only the abundance of the earth, but the prosperity of the people, and so expressions of intimacy were sometimes believed to invoke their blessings. Fertility was not a personal concern alone. It was communal, tied to the survival of clans and the success of harvests. To sleep with another was, in a way, to renew the pact between humans and the divine, to stir the same forces that called crops in the soil and stirred rain from the sky. It was no wonder, then, that acts of love were occasionally woven into rituals, dances, or fertility festivals, where the line between sacred and sensual blurred, like mist curling over the fjords. In such settings, the body was not simply flesh, but a vessel through which old powers moved. But these ideals also cast shadows. Not every encounter was joyful or equal. While Viking women enjoyed certain freedoms unusual for their time, including property rights, divorce, and even some influence in choosing a mate, the imbalance of power still lingered in certain unions, particularly when conquest came into play. The sagas are filled with tales of raids where women were taken as spoils, stories told with disturbing ease, accepted by the norms of that brutal age. Such stories reveal the darker undercurrents of Viking sexuality, where the violence of the sword sometimes bled into the intimacy of the bed. And though these acts may have been condoned by their warriors or chronicled in epic verse, they serve as a cold reminder that for all the richness of Viking life, it was still bound by the harshness of a world ruled by strength. Yet in more ordinary pairings, those not forged by violence or conquest, but by courtship, betrothal, and the slow blooming of familiarity, the physical relationship was often steeped in tenderness, custom, and the rhythm of daily life. After marriage, often arranged with the blessing of both families and sealed by gift-giving, couples would settle into a pattern where love, desire, and duty became tightly interwoven. There was a strong expectation that couples should fulfill one another's needs, and failure to do so, especially persistent, could be grounds for divorce. If a man ignored his wife sexually without just cause, or if a woman was found to reject her husband without reason, tensions could rise to the level of community concern. Intimacy, then, was not simply a private matter. It was a duty shared between two people, like tending the hearth or milking the goats. It was something that had to be nurtured, maintained, and honored as part of a life built together. And what of love in old age? While the sagas rarely focus on the quiet moments between elder couples, the archaeological evidence paints a picture of long partnerships, of shared burial sites and matching grave goods, of relationships that likely deepen over decades of shared struggle and celebration. Though perhaps the fire of early youth burned less brightly, it was replaced with a warmth more enduring. The comfort of bodies familiar, of hands that worked the same soil and stroked the same brows through illness and childbirth, loss and harvest. In that sense, the physical bond between Vikings, while perhaps less openly romantic by modern standards, possessed a depth forged by time and tested by hardship. In the end, Viking sexuality was not a single story, but many shaped by faith and necessity, by joy and violence, by myth and reality. It was celebratory and grim, sacred and profane, tender and transactional. It existed in whispers behind longhouse walls and in the songs sung beside the fire. And though centuries have passed and the sagas are quieted, their voices still echo faintly in the spaces between, in the ruins of their hearths, in the carvings on their stones, and in the bones that lie entwined beneath the earth, still telling their story in silence. Now, as the firelight flickers lower and the night deepens, we turn gently from the warmth of the Viking hearth and the shared breath of lovers beneath fur blankets, and we drift onward to the tales of those who lived at society's edges, whose desires or identities did not always fit the mold carved by tradition. And so, while the sea had long been a symbol of Viking power and plunder, it was also a silent witness to the most private of farewells and reunions, the tender homecomings, the whispered promises under low-thatched ceilings, and the quiet strength of bonds tested by absence. But life was never still for long in the north, and as the tide of one chapter ebbed, another would always begin, carried on the backs of old traditions and shaped by the quiet power of belief, in fate, in family, in the gods who watched unseen from the edges of the sky. For it was not only the known, visible world that influenced Viking thoughts about sex, love, and relationships. It was the unseen as well, the spiritual, the magical, and the mythical. In this next layer of their culture, one finds the ethereal world of Norse beliefs, the stories, superstitions, and sacred symbols that subtly shape how intimacy was viewed and practiced among them. To the Vikings, the soul was not confined to body, and neither was desire. The realm of the gods was intimately intertwined with human life, and nothing about love or sexuality was entirely mundane. Every passion had its mirror in the skies, and every longing had a mythic reflection. Take, for instance, the goddess Freya, a figure of immense power, revered as much for her role as a war deity as for her dominion over love, fertility, and sensuality. She was not portrayed as meek or submissive, but rather as radiant and commanding, desired by giants and gods alike. Her myths did not shrink from matters of the flesh. Instead, they exalted them. Freya was the embodiment of feminine power and erotic independence, a reminder to Viking women that sexual agency was not only acceptable but divine in origin. In stories passed down through generations, her necklace, Brisingamen, forged by dwarves and won through acts of seduction, gleamed as a symbol of beauty and the cost of desire. It told women and men alike that longing had its own gravity, and to follow it was not shameful but fated. And yet, Freya was not the only figure who colored the Vikings' understanding of passion. Loki, the trickster god, constantly challenged the boundaries of gender and sexual roles. His stories were filled with shape-shifting, with playing both man and woman, sometimes giving birth, sometimes fathering children. He reminded the Norse people that the world was never as fixed as it seemed, that rules were meant to be tested, and that identity, sexual or otherwise, could be fluid, mysterious, and richly complicated. These tales didn't carry the heavy moral condemnation found in later Christian texts. Instead, they suggested that the gods themselves were curious, conflicted, and beautifully flawed, much like their mortal worshippers. Such mythological patterns found echoes in daily life. Among the common folk, rituals of fertility and love often drew upon sacred symbolism. When crops were planted or marriages arranged, offerings were made not just for material success, but for the blessings of sensual connection. Some communities practiced quiet rituals of love magic, herbal concoctions whispered over, amulets worn beneath garments, runes carved with intention onto small wooden slivers. These were not considered taboo, but simply part of the world, tools to help guide fate along favorable paths, no different from charms against illness or spells to bring fair weather. Women, especially, might turn to seeresses or wise women, known as vulvas, for help in matters of the heart. These mystic figures, respected and feared, could see into the threads of destiny. Their visions might help a young woman choose between suitors or reveal whether a husband's affections were true. The vulva's guidance was often poetic, filled with metaphor and myth, and carried a weight that even chieftains would heed. For in a world where the future was hidden behind the mists of the Norns' weaving, any glimpse at clarity was precious. But not all supernatural beliefs were gentle. Some fears, too, hovered around intimacy. There were tales of Draugr, the restless undead, who sometimes returned from their graves, not just to haunt the living, but to seek out old lovers, drawn back by passion left unresolved. These eerie myths served as quiet warnings. that unfinished longing could linger beyond death, that desire needed closure, and that even the heart must sometimes be laid to rest. Viking beliefs also framed the consequences of unfaithfulness or betrayal. While there were legal repercussions for adultery in certain contexts, the spiritual consequences often seemed more potent. Shame, dishonor, and divine disapproval could haunt a family, and such breaches of trust might attract the attention of spirits who watched silently over the household. Stories told by firelight warn of households cursed by broken vows, animals born sickly, milk souring without cause, sleep plagued by strange visions. These weren't simply superstitions, but reflections of how deeply connected the Vikings felt their moral and emotional lives were to the natural and supernatural world. Even childbirth, the most intimate result of sexual union, was surrounded by spiritual belief. Midwives might mark the bedpost with runes to protect mother and child, and offerings would be left for goddesses of fertility and protection. In the dim light of longhouses, as pain and hope mingled in equal measure, families would murmur prayers to Freya or Frigg, asking for mercy, for strength, and for life. Sex was not just about pleasure or union. It was tied to the cycle of creation, to the perpetuation of the clan, and to the will of forces far greater than any individual. And so, while many might imagine the Vikings as coarse or overly physical in their attitudes toward intimacy, the truth is far more nuanced. Their understanding of sexuality was layered with myth, ritual, and reverence. Desire was not seen as base or shameful. It was simply part of the greater rhythm of the cosmos, as natural and mysterious as the seasons or the tides. Their gods felt lust, gave birth, seduced, and wept for lost lovers. Their people, too, loved and longed, not in silence, but in the full knowledge that they were echoing stories older than time. Thus, each kiss and caress, each glance and promise, existed within a larger frame, one shaped by stars and stories, by runes and rituals, by gods who both protected and punished. The Vikings did not separate the spiritual from the sensual. They wove them together, like threads of a well-crafted sail, trusting that both were needed to navigate the unpredictable sea of life. In this, perhaps, they were wiser than many who came after, for they knew that to love well was not to deny the divine, but to live it. And so, belief itself became a kind of intimacy, an unseen thread binding body and soul, lover and loved, God and mortal, until the two could no longer be told apart. Even as time wore on and the embers of youth gave way to the settled rhythms of life, that same warmth lingered, not only in their bedchambers, but in the way their stories were told around the hearth, in the way they touched shoulders when passing, in the silence that felt like peace, not absence. For all the tales sung of their battles, raids, and conquests, it was in the quieter, often invisible rituals of closeness that Viking intimacy truly thrived. And so, with each passing season, a deeper current of connection carried them forward, not only in their roles as husband or wife, but as quiet witnesses to each other's becoming, long after the first fires of passion had cooled into steady embers. Yet this understanding of intimacy, this quiet, enduring bond, was not merely a personal matter. In the Viking world, it was steeped in symbols and beliefs, shaped by layers of ritual and cultural meaning that lent even the simplest gesture a sense of sacredness. For them, physical union was not only flesh meeting flesh. It was an offering to gods, a renewal of the cosmic order, and a rhythm that echoed the cycles of the land, the sea, and the sky above. In the shadow of their longhouses, surrounded by carved posts that bore the images of gods and beasts, Viking couples often engaged in more than just private affection. They participated in traditions that bound their love to the very essence of their people's mythology. The Norse cosmos itself, with its tree Yggdrasil connecting the worlds, mirrored the unity they sought, where roots and branches intertwined, chaos met order, and male and female energies found harmony not through dominance but balance. Fertility rituals, for instance, were not strange or hidden things. They were communal acts of reverence, celebrated at the changing of seasons, during solstices and when harvests were sown or reaped. The most sacred of these rites were often led by seeresses, vulvas, who guided communities in rites meant to honor Freyr and Freya, the gods of fertility, love, and pleasure. Offerings were made not just of food and animal sacrifice, but also of symbolic union, a blessing upon the marriages within the clan and upon those yet to come. In these moments, it became clear that what modern eyes might view as private or hidden was, in the Viking world, intricately woven into the fabric of communal life. A child born was not just a concern of mother and father, but a continuation of the clan spirit, a thread in a much larger tapestry that stretched back to Odin himself. And so, when intimacy was shared, it was shared with the awareness that every act resonated through the halls of ancestors, the cycles of nature, and the stories to be sung in generations yet unborn. Even the use of amulets and charms reflected this sacred layering of belief. It was not uncommon for a woman to wear a small pendant of Freya around her neck, believed to invite both love and protection. A man might carry a rune-etched token inscribed with Gibo, the rune of partnership and sacred exchange, tied to the idea that what one gave of themselves must be met in kind. Their intimacy, then, was never a transaction, but a gift freely given, blessed, and received with reverence. Of course, in a world both harsh and unpredictable, where the sea could claim ships without warning and the winters could starve entire villages, love was never simply soft or sentimental. It was also fierce, protective, and deeply practical. A man who shared a bed with his wife knew she might also be the one to wield an axe if raiders came in the night. A woman who bore children did so with the same strength she showed hauling water, tending to livestock, and keeping the hearth fire alive when her partner was gone for weeks at sea. This mutual respect, born from shared struggle and endurance, formed the bedrock of their intimacy. It was not shaped by ideals of romance alone, but by a deep trust that each would hold the other in both desire and danger, in youth and in the long hush of age. And that trust was built slowly, night after night, across countless acts of tending, touching, teasing, and holding, not always perfectly, but always persistently. They did not write love poems as often as they carved runes into wood or bone, but those runes, left on combs, sword hilts, doorposts, told their own stories. Remember me, one might say, or I think of you. Sometimes crude, sometimes tender, these inscriptions were tokens of desire that extended beyond flesh to memory, legacy, and the eternal return of seasons. A kiss in the morning might be followed by weeks apart. A lingering glance across the hall might be all they could share before duty pulled them in opposite directions again. But they remembered, and they found ways, always, to signal their connection, in the way meat was carved and passed from hand to hand, in the weaving of a new garment, in the singing of a certain tune only they knew. All of these were threads of a larger fabric. The fabric of intimacy not as a moment, but as a life's work, carefully and continually stitched with patience and purpose. In time, as the years gathered like snowdrifts at the longhouse door, the fiery heat of early passion gave way to something quieter, but no less powerful, a kind of soul binding that needed no ceremony to mark its depth. It was in the way one could finish the other's sentence, or in the knowing silence held between them when a child's cry echoed at midnight, or when the first frost dusted the field outside, and they both remembered the harsh winter 5 years before. And when death finally came, as it always did, perhaps on the battlefield, perhaps in the cradle, perhaps in the quiet stillness of old age, the love they had shared was not buried with the body. It was carried forward in memory, in story, in the touch of fingers tracing runes, or in the voice of a daughter singing an old lullaby to her child. For the Vikings, nothing was truly lost. Everything returned, in spirit, in wind, in waves, just as intimacy itself was not just a chapter, but an eternal strand in the ever-spinning thread of life. And so, in these quiet understandings, these glances, gestures, and shared silences, one finds a true heart of Viking intimacy, not just in the act itself, but in what lingered afterward, in the space that held them, in the fire that warmed them, in the breath that passed between them as sleep finally came, wrapped in a hush of love, of loyalty, and of lives spent not just surviving, but truly seeing one another, even in the dark. A rare comfort found in arms that were neither strange nor violent, but known, familiar, and woven into memory like a thread that never quite frayed. And when such comfort was shared in quiet hours, far from the clang of blades and the weight of woolen tunics, it was often unspoken, but deeply understood. For the Vikings, whose days were filled with hardship, conflict, and the constant whisper of the sea, intimacy had to be more than a bodily act. It had to mean something enduring, something tethered to kinship, ritual, and survival itself. It was in the stillness after passion, when the fire burned low and the coals whispered in their orange bed, that the Viking soul was perhaps most exposed, not during raids or boasts, but in those tender, unguarded moments where no songs were sung and no sagas would be written. For despite their outward strength and the harshness of their lands, the Norse people were deeply layered. And nowhere was this more evident than the quiet ways they handled the feelings that inevitably arose between lovers, companions, and spouses. Love, though not often named aloud in their surviving texts, was not unknown to them. The sagas, stern, sprawling, filled with blood and frost, are nonetheless dotted with moments of immense, aching feeling. A man mourning his dead wife refuses to remarry even though the community urges him to take another. A woman gives up her inheritance, her family ties, and her land to follow the man she loves into uncertain exile. These are not the flamboyant gestures of romantic poetry, but the slow, considered sacrifices of people who understood that affection was something one did, not just something one felt. And yet, beneath this quiet discipline was a depth of emotional intelligence that we often fail to recognize in the ancient world, one that saw not just the utility of connection, but the essential humanity of it. For couples who found harmony, their bonds became essential foundations of the household, not only for emotional companionship, but for the survival of the family itself. A good partner was not simply someone to share warmth in bed, but someone to carry buckets, tend goats, teach children, spin yarn, bake bread, mend sails, stitch wounds, or share laughter under dripping thatch. A Viking marriage, even when arranged, was ideally built on mutual reliability. And while power structures existed, and husbands often held more legal sway, there was a striking degree of balance compared to other medieval societies. A woman could divorce her husband if he struck her or brought shame upon her. She could keep her dowry, retain property, and even remarry as she wished. These were not gestures of equality in a modern sense, but they were certainly signs of agency, and with agency came dignity, and from dignity, something like love could grow. But it wasn't always easy. Viking relationships, like all human arrangements, were shaped by imperfections. Some men took concubines, especially when away at sea or abroad, and while this was often accepted by custom, it did not come without tension. Jealousy, quiet suffering, and even revenge found their place in the saga scrolls. Wives were not always silent in the face of betrayal, and some are recorded as having taken lovers of their own, risking shame, exile, or worse. It was not a world of perfect devotion or chivalrous romance, but one of hard truths, quiet accommodations, and the occasional, thunderous fallout. Emotions ran deep beneath the stoic surfaces of their faces, not always spoken, but deeply lived. When grief came, it came like a storm, not just for fallen warriors, but for lost children, departed lovers, and missed opportunities. A man might burn the boat he had built with a brother after that brother's death, or a woman might refuse to remarry not from custom, but from grief that never settled. These were people who carved runes into stone not just to mark battles or borders, but to remember, to hold fast a memory and meaning. They etched the names of the dead into wood and bone, placed tokens on burial mounds, and spoke their names aloud so that they would not vanish into silence. And yet, amidst all this depth and sorrow and passion, there was laughter too. Norse poetry, often composed around the hearth, could be bawdy, playful, full of sly innuendos and cheeky comparisons. Couples teased each other, made wagers, challenged one another's wits, and sometimes, in those rare cases when a union was more than survival, delighted in each other's presence. It wasn't always grand or poetic, but it was real. A woman might laugh at her husband's clumsy attempts to fix a roof, only to help him do it better. A man might carve a silly figure into a beam just to make his wife smile. These quiet gestures were not legendary, but they were the glue of life, and in that way, more profound than any tale of gods or giants. And so, in these often forgotten details of affection, a woven belt gifted on a winter's day, a shared cup of mead, a song hummed to soothe a frightened child, we begin to see the true intimacy of Viking life. Not just a firelight and bodies entwined, but the years lived side by side, the sorrow weathered and the strength shared. These were not sentimental people, but they knew love in the way a tree knows the wind, by how it shapes you slowly and never quite lets go. They may not have had a word for romance as we use it now, but they had rituals, memories, losses, and bonds. Things that held weight beyond battle, beyond inheritance, and even beyond death. And in this, perhaps, they understood something essential, that the true mark of closeness is not found in grand declarations, but in quiet loyalty, lived across days that no one will ever write down. And it was through such steady, understated devotion that many Viking homes endured through the centuries, remembered not for their walls or axes, but for the resilience of hearts that beat together through snowstorms and silence, leaving behind only a few quiet lines carved in stone. Echoes of love in a world that never quite learned how to say it aloud. And in this final act of surrender and vulnerability, there echoed a truth that no axe or shield could ever quiet, that the Viking world, for all its bluster and brutality, was also a place where hearts beat quietly beneath woolen tunics, where longing and loss mingled with honor, and where even the fiercest warrior might once knelt before a small fire, whispering a name they dared never speak aloud. Though sagas sung of war and wandering, though runestones bore the names of sons lost across the seas, not every story etched into the Viking spirit was one of conquest or blood. There were other sagas too, ones not told around firelight in boastful verses, but preserved in a hush between generations. These were the soft stories, the almost forgotten rhythms of closeness, touch, and memory that lived on not in stone or steel, but in the inherited instincts passed down quietly through time. For the Vikings, the physical was never merely physical. It was a language, a message, a marking of time and emotion across bodies built as much for enduring storms as for embracing stillness. Even as the days grew colder and the wind shifted from west to north, signaling the changing of the season, the old rituals continued with their slow precision. In dim rooms lit only by the flicker of oil lamps, women still combed their hair before sleep, fingers slow and methodical. Children still curled beside their mothers on shared furs, their small breasts shallow with slumber. And lovers, whether married or simply bound by fleeting unions, still reached across wool and woolen tunics to find one another, not for lust alone, but for the quiet recognition that even warriors were never meant to sleep alone every night of their lives. A Viking night did not always bring silence. There were songs, soft ones, meant only for one listener at a time. There were stories whispered just before the edge of sleep, when the mind wandered toward dreams. There were hands seeking warmth beneath layers of fur and linen, and there were hearts that beat slowly, rhythmically, in time with the old pulse of the North. And though few would write these moments into runes or immortalize them in poetry, they were no less real, and perhaps all the more sacred for it. In a longhouse nestled within a clearing, far from the sea, a woman might lie awake and remember the first night she was chosen, not in a way that stole her agency, but in a way that made her feel seen, respected. A look across a fire, a gift of carved wood, a conversation not about rating or weather, but about the small beauty of a well-tended sheep or the cleverness of a child's laughter. These were the first flirtations. And in remembering them, she might smile in the dark and reach for the warmth beside her, the man who once offered her a dried fish with a half-smile, and the awkward certainty of a boy trying to impress. And somewhere else, perhaps by the fjord's edge, a man might watch the stars and recall the scent of wool still warm from another's body, the memory of fingers tracing the edge of a woven band around his wrist, the softness of breath on his skin, not in passion, but in trust. In return, he might reach into his tunic and retrieve a carved trinket, a small token whittled in idle moments and held not for its shape, but for the hands that once held it too. These private keepsakes, fragments of feeling preserved in wood, cloth, or memory, were what truly bound Viking lovers across distance, season, and silence. These were the truths never told in the sagas. No skull would sing of the way a woman leaned her head on a man's shoulder after a day of flax pulling, or how two warriors, weary from their journey, once share a moment in the dark, not of lust, but of stillness, leaning against the same wall as rain drummed on the thatch above. There were no oaths sworn here, no boasts or blood, only the understanding that in a world ruled by blade and storm, softness was its own kind of rebellion. Even in marriages arranged by families for land, status, or alliance, tenderness found its way in, sometimes slowly, like thawing ground in early spring, sometimes unexpectedly, like a gull landing on a ship's mast at sea. Respect grew from shared burdens. Intimacy deepened with time, not just in the act of lying together, but from building together, homes, meals, children, silence. And where respect lived, desire followed. Not always fiery, not always spoken, but enduring like the coals that never quite died in the hearth center, even by dawn. There were, of course, darker stories too, moments where power was misused, where duty became coercion, and where silence did not equal consent. The Vikings were not saints. Their passions could flare into anger just as easily as affection. And in a time where strength was often mistaken for dominance, not every union was kind. But even here, there were shifts. There were women who refused, whose words were honored. Men who asked, even when they didn't have to. Communities where shame followed those who took what was not freely given. And while these values were not always held high, they existed, and they mattered to those who dared to live by them. Over time, as Christianity crept northward and monks scribbled their own versions of Norse life, much was lost in translation. The physical freedoms, the quiet sensualities, the mutual understandings that governed private love, these were flattened, erased, or misrepresented. But the memory of them lingered in folk songs, in grandmothers' tales, in peculiar customs that outlasted conversion. A touch, a glance, a feast shared in silence. These, too, were holy things. In truth, what the Vikings knew, and what perhaps we have forgotten, is that connection is not always loud. It does not always demand. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it listens. Sometimes it finds its home in the hush between storms, in the rustle of furs as one body shifts closer to another, not for conquest, but for comfort. And so, in the final years of the Viking Age, when the longships began to rot and the gods grew quiet, it was not the weapons that lingered most in the minds of the people, but the warmth of human closeness. The way fingers remembered fingers. The way laughter echoed in winter rooms long after the voices had faded. The way love, complicated, messy, unsung, still managed to find its way, even in a world made for war. Because even in a land of ice and iron, where wolves howled and the sea stole suns, there was still space for warmth. Still space for stories that never made it to stone. Still space for the simple, sacred truth that no one, not even a Viking, was ever meant to go through life untouched. And still, through the shifting ages and crumbling temples of time, what truly endured was not the shouting of war, nor the trembling of empires, but the quieter truths, the ones that linger not in sagas or stones, but in the moments that pass between two people in a hush of northern night, by firelight, beneath fur and breath and the slow turning of seasons. In this final part of our exploration, we return once more to quiet corners of the Longhouse, not to uncover new laws or customs, but to understand something deeper, the human heart beating gently beneath layers of ritual, gender, and survival. For sex in the Viking world, despite all its symbolic and structural weight, ultimately settled into rhythms that are remarkably familiar and achingly tender in their simplicity. While the written sources left behind by the Norsemen, the Eddas, the sagas, the scalded poetry, may roar with bravado and mythic exploits, those documents offer only glimpses of how the physical and emotional bonds between lovers were expressed in ordinary life. The sagas may describe elopements and infidelities, accusations of impotence or witchcraft, but behind the drama lay a truth common across all cultures, that love, desire, and connection were deeply human matters, felt and experienced in quiet moments rarely recorded. The absence of explicit detail in the records is not evidence of repression, but perhaps a sign of respect. For these were things known intuitively, not spoken freely, and certainly not scrawled casually on stones meant to last 1,000 winters. A husband and wife in the Viking Age would have understood each other not by romantic verse or extravagant courtship, but through labor shared and silence honored. A woman might understand her husband's moods through the way he returned from sea, whether the salt still clung to his beard, or if his shoulders hung lower than usual. A man might watch how his wife wound wool with greater fervor when troubled, or how she paused longer over the hearth when her thoughts strayed. These were not loud people, and their intimacy was not noisy. The love they made, when it was made, was not expected to fulfill fantasy, nor was it romanticized in the modern sense. It was part of life, woven into the warp and weft of the home, much like weaving or tending goats or preparing salted fish for the winter ahead. Privacy, as we know it today, was not readily available in Viking households. The longhouse, shared with extended family, thralls, and sometimes even animals, offered little in the way of solitude. Yet couples still found time to slip beneath blankets of woven wool, to whisper in low voices when the fire had grown low and the others had drifted into the kind of sleep that winter darkness encourages. In these moments, sex was not a spectacle or performance. It was an understanding, an offering, not just of the body, but of trust, of willingness to create life or simply feel less alone in a world so often brutal and cold. And that world was brutal, filled with hunger, war, death, and weather that showed no mercy, which is why, perhaps, physical closeness held such meaning. It wasn't about passion alone, though passion surely flared now and then like lightning striking a pine. It was also about survival, both practical and emotional. Sex, like food or warmth, could be a comfort, a confirmation that you were still here, still whole, still worthy of softness even after a day spent gutting fish or burying a brother lost of frostbite. This was a world where death was always close, and the body, with its needs and its pleasures, was a way to fight against the cold hand of oblivion, if only for a night. Children were often a result of these unions, of course, and parenthood was not a casual matter in Viking life. To bear a child was to face danger for both mother and infant, and yet to do so successfully brought great honor and continuity. A woman who had birthed many children was respected for her strength, her endurance, and her sacrifice. And men, though they could not birth children themselves, were expected to contribute fully, to protect, to feed, to raise sons who could row and fight, and daughters who could manage homes and carry the line forward. Even so, not all sex was for reproduction, and the Norse did not shy from physicality in and of itself. There are hints here and there that pleasure was known and appreciated, that laughter sometimes followed lovemaking, and that the human heart, no matter the age, seeks connection not just for legacy, but for comfort. Some practices were darker, of course. As with all societies, power dynamics sometimes turn cruel. Slavery, though not always comparable to the chattel slavery of later eras, still stripped individuals of agency, and the abuse of thralls by their owners, sexual and otherwise, was likely not uncommon. In the quiet rooms of the powerful, consent may not have always been present. These shadows are part of the story, too, and while they are not dwelled upon in the lull of bedtime, they must be acknowledged as reminders of how easily desire, when paired with power, can tip into something unkind. Yet even within this complexity, there were rules. The law had something to say about every aspect of life, including what was considered dishonorable, unacceptable, or illegal in the bedroom. A man who dressed or acted too effeminately could be mocked or challenged, while a woman who stepped too far outside the bound of her role might be subject to gossip or worse. But there was also a surprising fluidity. Tales of shield maidens and strong-willed women, of men who expressed emotion, of gods who changed shape and gender, suggesting that the boundaries were not always fixed, that perhaps even in this stern, cold world, there was room for softness, variety, and love that did not always fit within straight lines. As twilight settled over the fjords and the longhouse dimmed once more, one imagines that Viking lovers, weary from the burdens of their day, reached for one another not with ceremony, but with familiarity. No need for words or songs or grand gestures, just a shared breath, a hand curled around a shoulder, a body warming another through the long, cold watches of night. And in that, something truly eternal, the need to feel wanted, safe, and known, not as warrior or wife, but simply as a soul wrapped in the arms of another, if only for a while. And now, dear listener, as you lie beneath your own blanket and the world grows soft around the edges, let your thoughts drift like snowflakes across a northern sky. Let the flicker of the hearth glow low behind your eyelids. Let the breath of those ancient lovers lull you into dreams of fjords and fur-lined comfort. You wandered far into the past. Now come back, slowly, gently. Sleep well and dream deep. The sagas can wait until morning.